Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this webinar to launch and showcase AIDR's new Land Use Planning for Disaster Resilient Communities Handbook. My name is Amanda Leck, and I'm the Executive Director of the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience. It is my pleasure to host today's webinar. The Land Use Planning for Disaster Resilient Communities Handbook is AIDR's latest published offering in the Australian Disaster Resilience Handbook collection. It is my pleasure to launch this handbook today. As we know, Australia has a high history of high consequence natural hazards such as bushfires, cyclones, floods, storms, and extreme heat. Land use planning that considers natural hazard risk is one of the most important, if not the most important, mitigation measure for preventing future disaster losses in areas of new development and enhancing the resilience of existing communities. The new handbook focuses on land use planning for new development and its role in supporting disaster resilient communities. Today we have three guest speakers who will unpack the national principles and guidance presented in the handbook. I will introduce our speakers shortly. But first, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we meet today. Here in Melbourne, that is the Wurundjeri people, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Just a bit of housekeeping before we get started. Today you will see presenters as well as their slides on the screen. You will be muted for the duration of the webinar. A significant component of this webinar is dedicated to Q&A. We ask that you please use the Q&A box to pose your questions, and we'll address these following our speakers' presentations. Please also feel free to use the chat function for general comments. Please make sure that you select all panelists and attendees in the chat window so that everyone can view messages during the webinar. We've had close to 580 people registered to participate in this webinar, so we do ask for your patience if there are any issues today. And please note that we will be recording this webinar and uploading it to the Knowledge Hub for you to view again later. Today, we are very fortunate to have three speakers presenting at this webinar. Professor Alan March, Professor of Urban Planning at the University of Melbourne. Professor Barbara Norman, Chair and Professor of Urban and Regional Planning, University of Canberra. And Duncan McLuckie, Principal Flood Specialist with the New South Wales Department of Planning, Industry and Environment. We are very grateful to have them presenting today, and I would also like to acknowledge the significant role they played in the development of this handbook. I'd now like to introduce our first speaker, Professor Alan March. Alan March is the Professor of Urban Planning at the University of Melbourne. His research includes the examination of practical governance mechanisms of planning and urban design and the role of urban planning in reducing disaster risks. He is the lead researcher on the Bushfire and Natural Hazard CRC research project integrating urban planning and disaster risk reduction.
Hi, I think that's my cue. Thank you very much, Amanda. It's wonderful to be here. So welcome and greetings to the large list of people who've chosen to attend today. And I see a lot of familiar names in the list coming through there. So hi, everyone. I approach this task with a certain level of humility and with some honour. It's an important thing to be a part of. And in some ways, the challenge was great to do this, that I think we've done a pretty good job in meeting it. I wanted to start by mentioning one thing though, the Bushfire Natural Hazard CRC, as Amanda mentioned, I'm the lead researcher on a project there. And it was fortuitous timing that we could bring in some of the findings from that project that was related to integrating urban planning with disaster risk reduction, to bring those findings in to the handbook, as well as continue to develop the handbook with various others. So I think it's a great example of teamwork and of drawing together disparate and related threads in new and creative ways. Next slide, please. There's the handbook, great production. It's very nice to see and to be part of this suite of handbooks that are being updated over time. Next slide, please. It was certainly a team effort in its production, and I'm going to show you the handbook mainly here and talk it through before Barbara and Duncan speak. So I'll show the handbook itself, and I won't read everything out on the slide. I'll let you read that, but I'll just try and communicate a main idea to give you a sense of how the guide's intended to work, as well as how it was put together. But very much a team effort, and so pleased to be a part of that. Next slide, please. The first thing that I wanted to mention, and I'll use the chapters as a rough guide, and perhaps you've even had a decent look through the guide itself anyway. But one of the things we realised early on was that, as well as linking the guide into the comprehensive framework of policies that are now emerging internationally and indeed in Australia, was also to emphasise some key principles and starting points. Now, I haven't put all of them on every slide here, but one of the things we realise we continue to need to fly the flag for is just the benefit of urban planning or land use planning, depending where you're from, or maybe town planning, to fly the flag for why town planning is so important, to link it in with some newer ideas on resilience, but to place communities first, and indeed the places where communities are anchored in all the multiplicities of that. So that's very much been the starting point. Next slide, please. The scope of the handbook covers what we might call the traditional or semi-traditional hazards. I would add to these that we're very much aware that there are more hazards out there than these, but that is the focus of this handbook. But I understand the handbooks, as they develop through AIDR, will encompass other hazards as well as things evolve. And I would add to this list the coincidence or multi-hazard or cascading effect events that are around this as well. So I don't think that we're just focusing on these individually. Next slide, please. So one of the things I'm really pleased we managed to do here, and again, I won't go through each one of these principles, is to establish principles that provide a starting point that join together the handbook and the way it's used across all of the big picture, right down to the micro detail. And some of the things that we feel are really important is just prioritising human life and minimising suffering alongside sustainability, and then seeking to really weave together the huge range of things that urban planning is meant to do, as well as to reduce risk. This is no small feat, and we very much felt the burden and the responsibility of trying to bring these things together in the guide. I guess time will tell if we've done a good job on that, but I think we've covered many of the things that perhaps weren't really joined together, and in particular to provide people with just a way of thinking coherently about this huge task of integrating urban planning with risk reduction in the various forms that's taking. Next slide, please. And of course, we ended up with 12, a dozen of these principles. And you'll see as you scan through those, hopefully they are very cogent and very clear, but also they do seek to set a high expectation where we're not just trying to conform here, we're trying to push the limits out for us all to do better in various ways. We all realise that there's plenty of scope to improve on these matters, as recent events will bear out. Next slide, please. So, Chapter 2, as I kind of mentioned before, we needed to promote, explain and argue for using evidence just why we need to deal with natural hazards and indeed how they interact with the built environment, the places that people build, use and value and evolve in over time, and to start to set out some of these key principles where we join together understandings of urban and spatial planning along with what we might roughly call the risk world, and starting to use carefully and relatively precisely terms like hazards and risks and vulnerability and exposure. Because one of the things I've found in my research and practice is that these terms are not always used well. So one of the real benefits of the guide is to start to really communicate in a coherent way how to think about these things and how to use these terms and concepts. Next slide, please. So one of the other things here is just starting to, in this chapter 2, I've got the example of bushfires here, but across the other hazards, we've got a similar approach of just explaining, in a sense, how the risk is generated, what are its drivers, what's the nature of the risk, and indeed its consequences. Next slide, please. Along the way, we've taken pains to hook into key aspects of national policy and indeed into international policies such as the Sendai framework, for example, and to sort of push them into the text in key locations that starts to build a coherent argument, not just for educational purposes, but for the use of the guide as people might go through a review or a policy production process, for example. So you can see there the National Disaster Risk Reduction Framework reproduced there in a format that hopefully has a nice flow in this document, as well as linking people out to a range of other documents as well. Next slide, please. So then what I think is a great innovation in this document is then starting to find ways to talk about this, this thing of urban planning alongside hazards and disasters and emergency and risk. And this is not an easy task, because often people think of planning as the bit they're familiar with or the bit they do. It could often be development control or other processes they're more familiar with. So we're at pains to sort of step back a little bit and think about the whole system, because many of the problems or the possibilities and the potentials of urban planning exist across these different scales of action in the planning system. So, for example, the graphic I've put up there is really an attempt to start to speak to and describe one of the many similarities of approach between, say, a risk management approach or process and an urban planning process. So if you're from one or both of those fields, hopefully they are quite coherent and actually provide great ways of explaining these things to others. Next slide, please. We were keen not to just make this an artificial approach to urban planning or land use. Is one of the challenges we face. So starting to provide graphic as well as written explanations of that has been quite beneficial to explain things to people and get them to think about it. As well as looking at the right-hand image there, thinking about process, because this is where urban planning happens a lot, in the process as well as getting the outcome. So to get people thinking across those different spheres of action. Next slide, please. So in that spirit of explaining the wider system, we took some time to start really thinking about, well, how would we describe across the different planning systems of Australia, but also thinking to an international audience who will find their own parallels with this, a way of just starting to think about how a planning system is put together. Depending on your background, this may be very familiar and perhaps old hat through to, oh, is that how it works? But you know, thinking about legislation, policy, regulation and standards and codes, describing them, and starting to think about what their potentials and perhaps their limitations are. So providing a good framework has been a key thing that I think we've done a pretty good job on here, in just setting these things out with a bit of clarity, rather than being clouded by the literally thousands of pages that are often in planning systems when you start to dig through. Next slide, please. So then after we think about how the planning system has its key components, then starting to think about the plans themselves. And of course, urban planning operates at a range of different scales, different types of planning. And so we started very carefully to try and drawing on international examples and terminologies, as well as those that are familiar to Australians, remembering we have different terminologies across the states, of thinking about, well, here's generally what's in one of these plans, and here's what it might do, what we can expect it to do, and perhaps if it's not doing it, what it should be doing in your planning system, to put the full suite of potentialities of urban planning together. Next slide, please. And you can see there perhaps the bit that most people are most familiar with is the zones and the overlays and those sorts of things, and in some ways the hazard maps, you know, the flood map or the bushfire map, which is sometimes a risk map depending on where you are. So hopefully by the time people get to here, and they don't have to read it sequentially, they've got a feeling for how the overall system sits together, and that actually often a lot of the solutions to our problems or our shortcomings might be further upstream, and I'm not talking about flood, Duncan's going to do that in a minute, but further upstream or in other parts of the planning system, as well as the zones and rules and overlays on your bit of land. And joining all that together, I think, has been something the document we've got now is starting to do. So that's a great step forward. Next slide, please. At the same time, we've taken trouble to use some of the key thinking from the risk world, and this is just not emergency and disaster, but it's going right out to ISO 31000 approaches to risk, finding familiar terminologies and approaches and starting to hook them into the planning world. There are other really important documents, such as that produced by the Planning Institute of Australia, that go into more detail. So we tried to complement and speak to and find and carefully find similar terminologies across these documents. And of course, risk and risk mapping and assessment and indeed treatment are core to what we need to do. Next slide, please. And then thinking about, well, most of the time where the rubber hits the road in urban planning is these ongoing processes. So we can't have urban planning having just policy or just plans. We also need the implementation, the regulatory bit. This is the bit that most people see most of the time as citizens and users, the permit process, the big projects that go on, the buybacks, etc. And putting this in context as well on how they're produced and perhaps some of the areas that perhaps we could aspire to across all the different hazards. A little note there in a breakout box. We've got lots of breakout boxes. The one on the screen now is about scenario testing. This, I think, is one of the areas we can really work on more, integrating it with the planning system. And before we pass the point of no return, we actually work out what the risks are likely to be in the future of different scenarios. And it is often the case that our planning systems lack that at the moment, and we need to find all the different places they can be plugged in. So the document's got lots of those little breakout boxes and explanatory components to bring it alive and to give places for people to go and look for more. Next slide, please. So last bit of the document, chapter 7, obviously planning systems are never perfect. Obviously, there's a lot more to an urban and regional and settlement system than just planning, of course, even though planners like me might like to think we're the most important. Clearly, we're not. There are many, many other players and actors and stakeholders. So in chapter 7, we set out a number of different challenges that exist in these tasks and roles would be naive not to acknowledge those. And even if it's just for explanation and for discussion, or if it's for further research and activity, there's a whole list of further issues and things to work on there. The one I've chosen to put up on the slide there, you'll see existing settlements. Clearly, that's Brisbane 2011. Clearly, there are a huge number of problems in our existing settlements. Some of those are emergent. Some of them may have things to do with climate change or ongoing settlement change, clearing, you name it. There's a whole realm of other work we could do in this area alone. I'd love it if we did another handbook on this area. So that's my little plug, maybe for some more attention to a new area I'd love to be involved in. But this is just to bring it alive and to really add a realistic appraisal of the complexities of this space with the further directions. So I think that's my last slide. I'll throw over back to Amanda. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Really appreciate that.
Thank you, Alan. That was really informative. We will be answering some questions at the end, so I'll go straight to our next speaker, Professor Barbara Norman. Professor Barbara Norman is Chair and Professor of Urban and Regional Planning at the University of Canberra. She has a combined professional and academic background as a former National President of the Planning Institute of Australia and a current leader in urban and regional research. Professor Norman specialises in cities, coasts and climate change adaptation and has an extensive publication record. Her next book will be in urban planning for climate change. Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you, Amanda, and thank you, Alan, for that excellent presentation. And good afternoon to all of you, and thank you for participating today. I'm giving a short response here, 5 to 7 minutes, so I'll be focusing on 5 clear messages, which are now up there. And you'll see a photo of myself in the fire-affected region of the far south coast of New South Wales in the immediate aftermath. And as you can see, even just from that photo, it was a very dramatic time, and the impacts are still being felt very significantly through Southeast Australia. The first point I'd really like to emphasise is the importance of mapping the hazards and an all hazards approach. So I think no longer, the manual really reflects this very strongly. No longer can we afford to be mapping for fire risk, for coastal inundation, for drought, for floods. We need to be bringing all those hazards together and clearly identifying where land is suitable for future urban growth and where land is not so suitable for urban growth. So mapping the hazards, investing in that mapping much more at both a national and local scale to provide the evidence that we need. And then linking with our land use planning, which is the subject of today, obviously, consolidating future urban growth into low risk areas in the future. I guess the key message here is we have enough of a legacy to be dealing with already, and we don't wish to be adding to that. And so the benefit of this manual for users, end users and researchers is that it does bring those hazards together and starts to crystallise what those key levers are that we can use to improve our response to those impacts. The second key message is we can talk about macro changes, which is really what I was just discussing then, about how we can strategically intervene to do better longer term land use planning. And many communities, coastal communities, bushfire affected areas and in the southeast of Australia, affected sadly by both at the moment and COVID as well, are looking at, well, how on earth are we going to plan for the future, and starting to look at adaptation plans, land use plans. I guess the second point here I'm trying to emphasise is that, yes, we absolutely need to do that work, and I'd be the first to champion that. But also you can make quite small changes as well. And so I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that, as Alan was really talking about, that more detailed work we can do, that affects everyday decision making in a city or a town, a country town or a village indeed. So whenever you walk in your street or your neighbourhood or your city, you will see redevelopment, reconstruction and infill development, renewal every day. So if we can build small process changes so it happens almost seamlessly in everyday decision making, building in those risk management issues, then I think that we can achieve significant change in the not too distant future. The third point is, especially now we're all online, not through choice, but our circumstances with COVID, that we really do maximise the use of smart technology in how we approach these issues. And I've got here smart digital platforms to better share our knowledge across the sectors, not just the province of land use planners or the province of emergency management people, or indeed the province of sciences, who often I find are just talking to each other. So we need to be having these smart digital platforms that we can very readily and freely, importantly, access that sort of information we need if we have to make decisions in our own communities, or indeed have a community forum to talk about these, how we can go forward better. The fourth point, very importantly, we need to be investing in good strategic planning, which is a very strong theme coming through the principles. It's not always been a sort of favoured activity in the last couple of decades, quite a very much more of a focus on development control, if that, but now, and a bit of a flavour of everything's negotiable. I think we're all recognising now that a solid investment in good strategic planning, good land use planning in our cities and our towns is actually fundamentally critical. And that's recognised very much in this handbook, and also very much by the Planning Institute of Australia in their leading document they released calling for a national settlement strategy for all the professionals in planning. It's called The Tipping Point, and I refer you to that as well. And I think these two documents have been dovetailed very well by active engagement by the Planning Institute in this process. Coming up to my last point here, supporting action with targeted, and I mean targeted applied research that can actually help the end user. So we need to be very much in this quite dynamic environment we're dealing with now, being continuously informed about leading practice and learning, as we say, learning by doing. So as we implement, for example, this manual, we need to be also very alert to how effective it is, and feedback from end users, and continuing to do the research on the ground to feed in. And of course, this organisation with AIDR and the Bushfire CRC and its new future, in new iteration, whatever that may look like, they're all AFAC, all critical to contributing to this agenda, along with universities across the country. So I think what this manual is really doing is crystallising these messages. Many of you would say, well, we've heard that before, but it is helpful, especially if you're in decision-making roles, that you could say, this manual has confirmed or reaffirmed these messages, and you could start to incorporate these, I think, with more confidence in whether you're writing a report to local council, whether you're writing a report to a minister, or whether you're having a community process. I will just finally finish that a very important message here, and Ella mentioned it as well, is community engagement, community planning. Doesn't matter where I look around the world right now, with all the sorts of issues people are dealing with climate risk, with extreme events, with COVID, really looking at very much going back to community planning, and how can we work together across the sectors, the disciplines, the professions, with the community to try and develop a more resilient future. So thank you very much for listening, and happy to participate in the Q&A later. Thank you, Amanda.
Yeah, thank you very much, Barbara. And Just with regard to your remarks around community engagement, AIDR will be showcasing the release of the Community Engagement Handbook at our upcoming Australian Disaster Resilience Conference Knowledge Week. So I think that will be very relevant to your comments there about community engagement. I'd now like to introduce our third speaker, Duncan McLuckie. Duncan McLuckie is an expert in flood risk management with extensive experience in government and consultancy. He is currently the Principal Flood Specialist in the Environment, Energy and Science Division of the New South Wales Department of Planning, Industry and Environment and Chair of the National Flood Risk Advisory Group. Duncan works at a strategic level on a range of flood-related policy, technical and industry education initiatives. He is the lead author of AIDR's Managing the Floodplain Handbook and is currently leading the update of the New South Wales Government's Floodplain Development Manual. And just a reminder to keep those questions coming in the Q&A session that will follow Duncan's presentation. Thank you, Duncan.
Yeah, thank you, Amanda. I'd like to thank, I'd also like to thank AIDR for the opportunity to be involved in the development of the guide and to speak today. I'm going to cover off on two essential elements for improving community resilience to natural hazards through land use planning. These are collaboration between land use planners, natural hazard managers and emergency managers. And this provides access to expert information and advice on natural hazards and their management, which is essential for informed decisions. And making informed decisions in land use planning that consider the full range of natural hazard events and the constraints they place on land. And this can minimise the increase in risk to the community due to new development. Next slide, please. Natural hazard management involves understanding the full range of natural hazard behaviour and constraints and how these vary and may change over time. Assessing options and making recommendations on managing risks. Supporting informed decisions on managing risk to existing and future development. And providing advice and information on natural hazards and their management to support decisions to reduce the impacts on the existing and future communities. And some of that's through land use planning, some through emergency management, and some through natural hazard management. And there are studies overseen and undertaken by experienced natural hazard managers through an appropriate risk management framework provide a basis for this work. Next slide, please. New development in areas affected by natural hazards will introduce new risk. It's the scale of that increase that can vary. So by effectively considering natural hazards, it can assist in limiting the growth of that risk to the community as the community grows and redevelops. And these risks can come from exposing more people and property to natural hazards, and also the fact that development can impact upon the natural hazard. It can actually change the behaviour of the natural hazard. For instance, it can change flood behaviour, and it can also impact on the community's ability to respond to a natural hazard. It can actually, if a community has to evacuate an area, it may extra people in that area or the way development occurs can actually influence that. And risk can also change because of exposure over time as aspects such as climate change and cumulative development impacts occur. And again, the natural hazard management processes give you an opportunity to understand those things. Next slide, please. If natural hazards were considered strategically through land use planning, community growth directions can be set, which can limit the growth of risk due to development and redevelopment. And this can inform decisions on where to develop, the type of development to develop where, and the development conditions needed. All of these factors will affect risk. Considering them has long-term benefits for community resilience for natural hazards. I think as both Barbara and Alan have mentioned, I think land use planning does have its limits when it comes to addressing risk to the existing community. Next slide, please. Given my background, I'm going to use an example in flood just to talk about considering the full range of behaviour. On the left-hand side of the slide, you'll see a more traditional use of flood information in land use planning. This uses a flood with a 1% or a 1 in 100 chance of being exceeded in any year in decisions and doesn't consider the risks of rarer floods. And it may not consider the full range of constraints. It may not think about emergency management or other issues from that area. On the right-hand side is the approach from AIDR Handbook 7, Managing the Floodplain, and the Guide 7.5 that supports it. This uses a full range of floods events, up to including extreme events well in excess of that 1 in 100 chance flood, and makes information on the varying constraints available on a single map so it can be more readily considered in decisions. And the idea there is to try and give an understanding of, as I think as Barbara mentioned, there are better places to develop, there are worse places to develop. The constraints will vary, and therefore the issues that need to be managed will vary, and it gives you the opportunity to look at how they might vary. However, I guess one of the key things to understand is while mapping is useful and it's a very important element, it doesn't tell you everything. They don't tell us how the constraints can be managed or how they can vary. This requires flood risk management and emergency management advice. And it needs to consider things like how fast the flood can occur, how long does it last, what is the range in terms of height of different floods, how exposed is the community to flooding, how does that change over time, can we rely upon the levee that's in purple on the slide to protect new development? What's the emergency management plan for the community? Are existing land use planning measures effective in managing risks? This is all advice that should be considered in these decisions. So it's not, maps to me are useful, but they are unlimited. They are limited in what they can do. And it's very much about connecting with that advice and expertise. Next slide, please. The advantage of collaborative efforts in land use planning are that the right natural hazard information and advice is used in support decisions. Not all natural hazard information is the same. You need to understand its fitness for purpose. And I think, again, talking to natural hazard managers can help you understand that. Informed decisions can consider the full range of natural hazard behaviour and constraints and the specifics of the situation. Natural hazard risks can be recognised and opportunities can be taken to build out some of the risks. Communities can grow in a way that is more resilient to natural hazard. And next slide, please. Overall, a collaborative approach between land use planners, natural hazard managers and emergency managers that considers the full range of natural hazards and their constraints is essential to inform decisions that help to manage risks to the community as it grows. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Duncan, and thank you to all our speakers for what's been a very informative session. I'd now like to go to the Q&A, and we've had a number of questions come in through the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens, but if you would like to either upvote some of those questions or pose a new question for the panel, we'll try to get through as many as we can in the time we have remaining, which is about 20 minutes. So I might get everyone to come back online. If you could all turn your cameras back on, please. And I might first go to you, Alan. There was specifically a question around the inclusion of Indigenous organisations and expertise in the preparation of this document. Perhaps you could answer that more broadly as well with, you know, the range of stakeholders that were involved in putting the handbook together.
Yeah, we didn't specifically target Indigenous inputs in a really direct way, but I would say it came up in a number of our conversations over time, and we sort of came to the conclusion that we would write the document in an inclusive way that could set out this expectation that we would, in ongoing processes, would provide lots of opportunities for stakeholders, because we're describing processes and outcomes and concepts here. But I'm sure we could do better into the future in directly addressing how to do that. There's a huge set of knowledges and abilities and connections to place that we are yet to even scratch the surface of, I think. But the other aspect is that we have a whole lot of sort of new settlers, as in those of us who aren't Indigenous. Our systems that we brought with us and have evolved over time need a lot of work as well, and integrating those is a whole other body of work. I would love that we had another handbook that worked on that, so there's another plug from me. Perhaps not exactly for me to do, but it may well require that we go back through our other handbooks as they evolve over time and integrate things more carefully, because this is an evolving and developing space. But I would like to think that the very community-oriented, stakeholder-oriented, multi-viewpoint approach that we propose would take those into account.
Thanks, Alan. I think this may be best directed at Barbara, but please feel free to answer it, anyone who's online. There's a number of questions around, does the handbook provide guidance on dealing with legacy issues? So, you know, existing risks, how we can deal with that. So, for example, buyback scenarios or flood resilient retrofitting, use of resilient materials and so on. So there's a number of sort of questions around that issue of the risks that we already have and how the handbook can be applied in that. Is that you, Barbara?
I can certainly start, and I think Alan, you might like to come in as well there. Certainly, if you look at the principles of the handbook, which set the framework for it, it is definitely setting out a framework for decision making around legacy decisions. So, as I indicated clearly, hopefully before, we are rebuilding our cities every day, and actually, the biggest challenge in many ways is our legacy. And so it provides the framework for state governments and local governments to say, well, when we do get a big urban renewal project, for example, then we should be applying these principles in this handbook to that decision making. So I guess at that higher level, it does provide, I think, very good guidance in that sense. Takes an integrated approach, takes a sustainable approach, and takes an all hazards approach. Alan, you might like to add on sort of more detailed statutory side.
Yeah, look, when we were in the early stages of the handbook, and so I agree with that, Barbara. In the early stages of the handbook, we had to take a path, and one of them was that this handbook would be mainly oriented to new development. However, that doesn't mean we're not concerned with legacy at all, but it's not directed at that specifically. My opinion is that legacy risks perhaps deserve a slightly different approach, using those principles and are more targeted on hazards and on places. And I think it's a whole other body of work, and it's probably more than one handbook, I would say. Not that everything has to fit into handbooks as a unit of measurement, but rather we decided to direct our attention with extensive consultation, including from AIDR, on new development. There's another reason for that, and that's where we don't create new unnecessary risk. So that's what this handbook's meant to do, and so we decided to do that this time. Yeah. Good question, really nice question.
Yeah. Can I add to that too as well? Because I think it should point towards, I guess, handbook like Handbook 7, managing the floodplain. We actually talk about those, specifically talk about how you might think about risk to existing communities, not purely in a land use planning sense, but more broadly in terms of what can be done to reduce those risks. And there are certainly other handbooks out there and other information available more broadly on that. Again, I think there's limited things that land use planning has a role, but that role is limited by the amount of redevelopment that might occur in a town often, rather than you might have to look at other types of options. Someone's being evacuated.
Not me. Amanda, are you being evacuated? Amanda, you're on mute.
Yeah, well, I'm getting a evacuate sign, so I might go to Caitlin to host the rest of the webinar. I'm being directed to evacuate the building.
Oh my goodness.
So Caitlin, can you come on?
Thank you, Amanda, for your hosting and direction.
Thank you very much. I'll get Caitlin to come on.
And if necessary, the three of us will carry on. This is called risk management and adaptation.
I think we have redundancy built into the system here. So.
There's Caitlin. Are you there?
Yes. Hello, everyone. Can you see me?
Yes. Yes.
So I've been monitoring the Q&A component, There's a question about how the document will actually be implemented and whether we'll have further guidelines for different disciplines or different hazards, and whether or not there'll be any other sort of educational sessions, if you like. Would anyone like to address that? And you can throw back to me as well if you like.
I wouldn't mind starting. There's a whole raft of answers to this actually, but my starting position for the handbook, and again, when we started, I realised, and everyone did, but my own personal journey on this is huge. Trying to compress the complexity of a planning system into a little document, it's not that little, but you know, is a huge task. And so again, you've got to kind of take a direction. What I like about the document that we've all contributed to is that it sets some standards, it sets some expectations, and while they can be achieved, there is a level of aspiration to them. And I would like to think that anyone who has some knowledge of their bit of these systems will find plenty of work to do, and will find processes, outcomes, use of terms, concepts, you name it, they will find work to do in their bit. The intention of the document was to cover sort of the whole thing, and indeed, as Duncan's quite ably pointed out, you know, just one hazard, flood, is just a component of it, and indeed there are already a bunch of handbooks covering other areas, but you know, like retrofitting and legacy as another one, and so forth. But the other thing we're dealing with here is a national approach, whereby a lot of the real legislation that puts the rubber on the road is at state level as well. But I wonder, Caitlin, you might want to mention a couple of the other handbooks, because I know Duncan and Barbara have got plenty to say, but what are the other relevant handbooks that might be useful?
There's also sort of the other part to that question as well, if we're going to be producing any more sort of practical implementation tools. So the answer to that is broadly yes, in that we produce, the plan is to produce a series of what we call companion tools that sort of provide that practical implementation component to the handbook. So that's what we'll be looking to do in the near future. And the aim is that these tools also help kind of implement the new policy directions set in the National Disaster Risk Reduction Framework. So that's sort of a significant task that AIDR takes on as well. Would anyone else like to comment on that?
I'd just like to make a couple of comments. Don't underestimate, this is just my view, but don't underestimate the value of affirming the importance of these principles, in a sense. There's a lot of cultural change in all the sectors to occur, which you can't sort of push too hard, and otherwise you'll get an adverse reaction. But if there is a national and subnational agreement to the principles here, as I said before, to sustainability, not arguing about climate change anymore, very much mainstreamed into this manual, into the National Planning Institute document, into the National Resilience Framework. So climate risk is accepted. These are very significant steps forward, I think. The fact that it's an all hazards approach, I think that if we can now sort of establish that, accept those principles, and then we've got a very strong foundation for moving forward from that. I wouldn't underestimate that in any way. It's for me, it's and the whole group, I think, here on this journey, it's a very significant step forward in not having to have that discussion around that anymore, but actually now focusing on codes, tools, also a whole gamut of implementation mechanisms. And just on the education side, wherever I've been working, there's an enormous gap still of capacity building around understanding, depth of understanding, particularly of mid-range professionals who, when they came through training, none of this was discussed, or very little of it. So I do think there's an enormous role there that all of us can play a part in.
Thanks, Barbara. And this question here is actually somewhat linked to what you've been saying there. It says, with more land use planning and integrated risk profiles, what blowback are we getting from insurers and property developers? Would you like to take the lead on that one, Barbara?
Well, certainly I can speak from my own experience, and my first expertise is in coastal planning. And this is anecdotal, I guess, it's my own experience. If I'd spoken to, and Alan knew me, 10, 15 years ago when I was doing a PhD in coast and climate change, when I engaged in those conversations, I'd just about be run out of town. And especially if I suggested we might have to step back from the coast. I find now that I don't get that reaction anymore. Even with the shock jocks of the world on the radio, I get, well, what can we do? How can we work with the community? What are the pathways? What are the options? And I think we saw that quite dramatically played out very recently with the houses falling just about into the sea on the northern New South Wales coast. Really, people coming together in a very urgent way to try and work out what the solutions are. Obviously, we need to get much more ahead of the game than that, and there's a lot of lessons to be learnt there. So, yeah, I think I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thanks, Barbara. Alan, Duncan, any comment on that question?
I guess maybe just a general comment. I mean, I think that connecting the communities is really important, and understanding and considering that climate change on those aspects. And I think that the natural hazard, the tools you have for managing natural hazards or looking at examining natural hazards, give the opportunity to understand how that might change, and that helps you to get information to actually think about and how you can then consider how you might think about it in the decision making.
I think also Alan mentioned, you might like to talk about it, Alan, is the scenario planning and the value of using that as a tool in community engagement.
Well, yeah, it sort of leads into what I was going to say, actually. There's a really strong role here for government, and it seems almost unpopular to say this, or slightly odd. It's a funny thing, isn't it? But there is a real role for government to set the parameters. And you will always get pushback or blowback or, whatever it might be, whether it's obvious or whether it's hidden through lobbying. But generally speaking, experience has shown that industry, the development sector, the community is appreciative of good, strong, clear and decisive, considered and based on evidence, parameters being set. And so Duncan's talk, I think, illustrated this beautifully using the flood example, having a good quality data set, but also working out what it really means and testing that against possible futures is the role of setting these parameters. And then we have a more level playing field, actually, and everyone benefits out of that. So to speak more directly about scenario testing, one of the sort of other legacy issues that is procedural in this country is that we have lost, or maybe we never really quite had it in some areas, this process that I would call best practice in urban planning, which is saying, well, here's 3 or 4 ways that we might develop the future. Here's where it might go. Here's where it might look, what it might look like. Let's now assess options A, B, C, and D against a whole range of criteria, one of which might be natural hazards, another might be equity and access to services and transport systems and so forth, and impacts on the natural world. And it is only when we truly embrace that we're going to manage risks appropriately, because what I've found in my research, and I think it's certainly affirmed by Barbara's research in coastal erosion and coastal management, that often we go past the point of no return before, as in kind of deciding or having a very strong push for development or change before we've assessed what the risks really are. And those risks are not just physical, of course, remembering impacts on community, social costs, and risks that are transferred many generations forward. So I think that's a really powerful thing to push through, that scenario testing, options testing with risk.
And can I just add to that, if you don't mind, Caitlin? I think if you're building on that again, I think certainly from a flood perspective, we can do that through the tools we have. We actually encourage looking at the cumulative impact of development. That's when you can actually look at it at that strategic level. It's very hard to look at it on a development by development basis. And you can also test the climate, again, the climate scenarios that might be there in the future. But I think one of the things to think about in terms of natural hazards is it's very, if you don't get it right up front, it's one of those constraints which you can't, it's very hard to fix later, and that's why you see those big legacy issues out there. So it's very important to think about it as a higher level constraint in terms of thinking about things from my perspective. So fixing things costs a lot of money, and it doesn't remove the risk. That's how focusing on getting it right up front is really important, which is, I think, is an important part of this manual.
Thanks, Duncan. I might hand back to Amanda now to wrap up the webinar. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you all. And it was a false alarm, but needless to say, the building evacuation system works very well. So on behalf of everyone who attended today, and we did peak at around 360 participants, I'd like to thank our guest speakers. So thank you very much, Alan, Barbara and Duncan, for showcasing the new handbook and sharing your knowledge, experience, and most importantly, your time. As I mentioned earlier, the next handbook that AIDR will be showcasing is the Community Engagement for Disaster Resilience Handbook. And given Barbara's remarks, there's a lot of synergy between those two handbooks. So I encourage you to attend that launch on Wednesday, the 26th of August. And you'll find details on the AIDR events page to register. So thank you very much for attending. I think we've got a lot out of today's session. And we'll be sending you a link to a recording of the webinar for those who attended today or to those who registered but were unable to attend. I also encourage you to explore the Australian Disaster Resilience Collection on the Knowledge Hub, which is where the webinar recording will be hosted alongside a suite of other resources. So thank you very much, everyone, for your time, and good afternoon.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.